Hey, everybody, it's Doug Green, and I'm the publisher of Technology Reseller News. And I'm very pleased to have with us today Steve Douglas, who is the head of market strategy for Spirent. Steve, thank you for joining me today.
It's good to be here, Doug.
So, we're going to be doing a very interesting survey of a report that you guys did, and especially about how AI is sort of impacting many things at the data center level. But before we dive into that, Steve, could you just tell us a little bit about Spirent?
Yes, so Spirent, we're one of the big test and automation companies for the ICT industry. So we work right across the ecosystem, whether it's chipset manufacturers, device, communication providers, right through to the enterprises and the data center providers, helping them test their infrastructure as they're bringing new technologies and new services to market. And we're worldwide, global business. And we've been focusing a large part of our activities lately more and more towards the evolution of AI coming into the networks, into the data center. And that's a sort of a big sort of focus area for where testing has been helping out over the last 18 months.
So you guys have released your high-speed Ethernet annual report. What did you find?
Yes, this is our inaugural report. We've been sort of running these types of reports for 5G over the last 5 years, basically sharing insights of what's been going on based on the unique visibility we get as a test company. As I said, because we work right across the ecosystem, we sort of see what not only what's coming, but also what the sort of the challenges and the headaches the industry is trying to deal with. Um, this report, it's based on over 340 plus engagements we had over the last sort of year period, and we decided to sort of share some of the key trends and takeaways of the report. Now, there's a number of key areas within it. The first of those, Doug, is very much around simply the growth again, I would say, of investment around Ethernet and the port densities that you're starting to see. So if you jump to the first to the next slide, Doug, you can see sorry, one more slide. You can see some of the volumes here we're talking about. There was over 70 million ports shipped on switches and routers last year, going into the industry, and there's been a big change here coming out of the back of COVID. There was sort of a downturn a little bit because there was oversupply into the market. A lot of people had built up stockpiles of equipment, and they were going through a period of consuming that as they were building out new networks. But over the last year, we've seen a rapid increase in terms of reinvestment again. And a lot of this has been driven by a couple of key dynamics. The first of those has been really around the impact AI has started to have, specifically generative AI, on our data centers. The data centers are going through a huge re-architecture at the moment to support that. And that's driving a sort of a flux of investment around new networks to support that. But it's not only in the data center. The report also highlights a couple of other key areas in the telecom network, especially around 5G. As a lot of the more mature 5G networks move to the next phase of 5G, which is called 5G standalone, they're upgrading their IP core transport infrastructure to support higher capacities to deal with the increased traffic volumes that they're starting to see. And we're also seeing quite a number of enterprises as well starting to evolve there and start to do refresh cycles as well. The higher capacities, anywhere up to 400 gig Ethernet being brought in, again, driven by their desire to support AI in many cases and specifically host their own sovereign large language models. So if we just, Doug, if you jump into the next slide, I think this has been probably the biggest sort of dynamic, that's happening at the moment, and especially with there's huge investments going into it, and this is really around the data centers at the moment. As I mentioned, the data centers are really the workhorses for AI at the moment. They're hosting these huge volumes of these GPUs to do all of the processing required for both the learning of the models and also for the inferencing. And there's a huge investment going on, not only to build out these mega data center architectures to support it, but also on the transport infrastructure to communicate between the GPUs within the clusters to allow that training. And that's triggering a large investment in technologies like Ethernet. to support that communication. And it's incredibly unique because the traditional data center architectures to this point, the traffic that they've been having to deal with has been more for sort of enterprise applications or you and I, the consumer. AI traffic has a very different behavior pattern, and it needs to be lossless. It needs to be massively low latency because to have these GPUs, which in many cases, we're seeing some of these data centers have up to 30 or 40,000 GPUs in these mega clusters. And, a GPU today is costing anywhere between 30 and $40,000. So these are, tens of, if not hundreds of millions of investment. And having any issues and delay of packets being moved between the GPUs as they're doing the processing means they can sit idle for long periods of time. And that's a huge sort of cost in terms of your investment. In addition, any losslessness in the traffic transport in terms of you're maybe dropping packets has a huge impact on how AI becomes trained, and it can introduce efficacy issues in terms to the models being produced. So there's a big focus at the moment on putting in technologies that can actually support not only the high throughputs, but as I said, the losslessness in nature, and sort of we're seeing big investments on Ethernet at the moment, and it's specifically a technology called Rocky V2. This is RDMA over converged Ethernet, and a lot of the industry is starting to move in that direction. And we highlight and talk quite a bit in the report about this. Now, the second sort of or third key takeaway with this, Doug, and if you just jump into the next slide, is actually the really around the testing requirements of it, because as I said, this network in reality is the foundations for making sort of these large GPU clusters operate successfully, and that means there's a huge overhead in making sure that this network is highly performant. And up until this point in time, the testing of this has been exceptionally complex. The only way to test it is to be going source real GPUs, build out sort of a huge GPU cluster yourself to generate all this novel traffic and then test the network against it. So in essence, you're nearly, a feedback we got and we put in the report from one of the big cloud providers that, they say it takes a data center to test a data center. And that's just not efficient or scalable. So, one of the big focuses the industry's been working on over the last sort of 12 months is how do you solve that? And the way to do this is through emulation. Could you create in essence, a virtual replica of a GPUs in an emulated environment to replicate how the XPUs or the GPUs behave and work and the traffic patterns they produce? And then you could use that in a more cost-efficient and scalable way to actually test that transport infrastructure. And that's where the industry is sort of moving to at the moment. And you're seeing a number of the big data center providers, the switch equipment manufacturers now using that to help them test and prove out the robustness of these new Ethernet networks coming in the future. So those are sort of the big three sort of takeaways dug in the report. But if you just jump into the next slide, and I'm not going to go through all of these, I just want to call a few out. But the report also looks at various different industry sectors as well, that are adopting it. So it's not just the data center networks on the left there, but it also explores, where is the evolution of Ethernet going in our telecom networks and also in our enterprise networks today. And if I just call out a couple of highlights here, again, in our telecom networks, we're seeing a couple of big sort of focuses of investment and testing at the moment, highlighting sort of what's coming, in the next sort of 12 to 18 months. I think one of the big key areas here has been networks for AI. Again, that inflection point with AI. Up until this point in time, most AI traffic from an end application, maybe on your device, going out through the network to the cloud, has been sort of conversational or text-based. So it hasn't really generated huge traffic increases yet on the networks, but we're now starting to see more and more volume of traffic increase, specifically as you're starting to see more advanced applications like video generated AI. And that means the telecom networks have to also evolve to handle that additional capacity. But also many of the telecom operators are starting to explore how they could become more of a bigger part, I suppose, of the value chain. And you're starting to see them think about offering their network as a service, where they could utilize their sort of mobile edge infrastructure to host, say, inferencing closer to the user, providing lower latency. You're
Hmm.
starting to see them explore also optimizing things like network slices to provide, better quality or prioritization around the traffic being generated by AI. So specific mission critical applications would have higher prioritization potentially, while say large training requirements of moving data about the networks could be given also specifically, say, higher bandwidths going forward. So we're starting to see quite a bit of focus there. And on the enterprise side, there's a couple of sort of, again, interesting takeaways here. We're starting to see, as I said, we're starting to see the larger enterprises start to focus on a transition to higher capacities as well. Again, driven by this term you might start hearing called sovereign AI, this
Hmm.
desire to basically to host their own large language models as well. So not necessarily be dependent on a generic model hosted purely by in the cloud. And this has been driven by a couple of dynamics. The first of those is very much around new regulations we're starting to see coming in many markets, where they require the data to be hosted locally within the region or potentially even within that industry and the company itself. Um, the secondary one is really around, their own desire to be able to specialize it for their own needs, and again, sort of hosting it themselves. So not all enterprises will go that way, but we're starting to see more and more sort of focus on that. And the other sort of takeaway that the report talks quite a bit about is just the security aspect as well, especially out towards the enterprises. We're seeing quite a large focus as well on sort of the firewall security gateway suppliers evolving their portfolio as well to plug into this evolution going on. Not only are they embedding AI capabilities in their own solutions to be more advanced, more protective, we're also seeing them as well invest in many of newer technologies to support the higher capacities so that they can provide sort of maintain, say, lower latency as they're doing sort of some of the security aspects, but also starting to implement newer technologies like post-quantum cryptography, which is going to be coming, we reckon, in the next 12 to 18 months, to provide an even more secure mechanism for many of these mission critical industries to support. One of the big challenges we're seeing in the market at the moment is there's a high risk that although quantum computing is still a number of years away, unfortunately, the hacker community is harvesting now to decrypt later is the terminology. So they're stealing it now, even though they know they can't access it, but they know in a few years' time when quantum computers are at a price point and availability, they will be able to then break in. So there's a lot of new algorithms coming out that have been made available by major bodies like NIST in the US. And you're starting to see, obviously, the firewall, the gateway vendors looking to bring them in the next number of months. And then a large number of the enterprises are starting a strategy of how they'll gradually implement them to provide that sort of early protection. So lots of dynamics, Doug, going on at the moment in the Ethernet world. A lot of it, as I said, has been driven by AI, putting new emphasis on the behavior, the capacity of the Ethernet networks, how they're now going to be used in our data centers. But also, as I said, it's now impacting also the broader networks, both out into the telecoms and the enterprise as well. And the report covers a lot more in depth here, but these are some of just probably the most interesting findings I thought I'd like to highlight today to the audience.
Well, given that this is just a summary of the report, there's a lot here to absorb. That's for sure. Sticking with the enterprise, we have a lot of enterprise readers and so on. I want to go back to what you were talking about. Tell me a little bit more about this sovereign issue. Is are you talking about uh, literally government basically saying the data needs to happen here locally on our soil on domestically? Is that part of the picture?
That's part of it. You're saying sort of government in some geographies.
Right.
It's not yet it's not an official mandate. It's more a recommendation. But we're also starting to see some policies starting to come where they are demanding it. It's primarily towards mission critical industries at this stage. But we do anticipate from the way a lot of governments are moving at the moment is that we anticipate you'll see more demand across all sort of enterprises. I think, Doug, this has been driven sort of also in the background by a lot of focus on something called operational resilience. there's been so many major network outages in a lot of industries over the last number of years. You've saw a number of major banks, financial institutes
Right.
over the last sort of 6 to 9 months have had pretty large outages. You've had a lot of other telecom network operators have had issues. You've saw utility energy supply companies. And that's, those outages have been a mixture of, security issues because of rogue state activity attacking them. But they've also been from things like simply like upgrades which have gone wrong across the networks, and they've caused issues. So there's been a big focus, a lot of around that, and that's sort of driving in the background this view that a lot of the it's tying itself to sort of a lot of the data privacy requirements that have been being looked at. And as I said, you're starting to see this term, this sovereign AI coming to the fore at the moment. Now, there may be multiple ways of doing this as well, Doug, which is quite interesting. So it's not a case of it's going to be one or the other. An enterprise is not going to work with, say, a large cloud provider, but it may be the case is that they'll host some data or say some smaller language models locally to meet those requirements, and then they'll still connect into the larger data centers as well. So we'll probably see some types of hybrid architectures evolve over the next number of years. It's still very early days, and I think the policymakers, they're also starting to learn and sort of try to work out, what's both what's required, but also what's practical as well.
The reason I asked that enterprise question is that I know that a lot of folks out there want to plan, and even if those regulatory issues are not, or structures are not fully in place yet, it sounds like we're hearing an early warning bell that maybe you ought to have some of the data at home, so to speak, or wherever you have global operations, but wherever you are, maybe the data ought to be there.
Yeah, I think that's going to be one part of it. I mean, one of the requirements we're seeing consistently across most markets, global markets, is also the need to be able to identify and provide evidence where you got the data.
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
where's it come from, and have you the right to use it?
right.
And that can be difficult if you're using a huge resource with there's lots of data that you have no auditability on or traceability on. So I think that's going to be one of the drivers of it. I do think there's going to be a practical sort of nature with policymakers as well. They are aware that they don't want to stifle innovation either, because at the same time, and also, I mean, a topic I know is pretty high at the moment. Also, just from a sustainability perspective, does it also make sense, to have hundreds of thousands of enterprises, building their own mini data centers, all consuming power and energy as well? I mean, that's not
Kind of,
necessarily a great,
yeah. I mean, it
a
kind of
good.
kills the whole idea of the cloud, right? The whole theory.
It does. So I think
Yeah.
there will be some form of compromise or better guidance gradually coming at the moment, but it is certainly for enterprises to look at. I think the quantum one is definitely something the enterprises, Doug, need to look at early, because although, as I said, the risk, you could argue, in terms of, say, the availability of quantum computers is still 3 to 5 years out, maybe. I said this concern that we're starting to see is that large hackers, state-sponsored hackers, are starting to steal data now
Yeah.
to decrypt later, means that a lot of the systems are starting to become at risk. And as I said, there are these new algorithms available. You're going to see most of the equipment manufacturers start to support those during 2025. The challenge is it's not just an easy upgrade for an enterprise, because it's not simply just a software patch or an upgrade. These, unfortunately, this technology, this post-quantum cryptography technology, puts new constraints in terms of what type of sort of CPU consumption it requires, what memory it requires. So it may require upgrades across the networks as well. And one of the things we're seeing at the moment is a lot of sort of focus around trying to initially, at this stage, as an enterprise, identify where you might need to upgrade and start to develop sort of a plan and a prioritization strategy around that. So I think you're going to see more around that. And again, I would advise, if you're an enterprise and you're not looking at this now, I think probably start early, because it's going to take a number of years to gradually do these upgrades and to support this, but it is absolutely critical you do.
Now, you've talked at length about the impact on telecom networks in this segment, but are they going to be particularly impacted by things such as power and some other issues, maybe security?
Yes, I mean, power is a very hot topic at the moment, in terms of trying to, I suppose, like a lot of industries, reducing energy consumption. There's lots of movements going on here, focus around that. Just again in the report here, we talk a little bit about the movement to some of these higher capacities, like moving, say, from 100 gig links to suddenly 400 gig and then up to 800, actually brings huge energy efficiencies in the way the equipment and the amount of throughput you can drive to drive energy efficiency. So you're starting to see sort of people look at those refresh cycles, although they mightn't necessarily need the capacity on day one, it actually is more energy efficient for them to sort of upgrade to more modern technology and equipment, which is actually more energy efficient. So you're starting to see those types of dynamics, but you're also starting to see a focus also on new types of technologies we're starting to see appear around for cooling, how cooling is going to be brought in, because today the traditional methods in both telecom networks and the data centers for cooling using air conditioning is incredibly expensive in terms of its energy consumption. So what they're looking at is things like liquid cooling. We're starting to see more and more of more and more designs based around that. In fact, we're even seeing a customer of ours who's a data center provider are hosting part of the data center in a lake for a cooling purpose. So it's submerged. It's built under as a mechanism around that, and that has an interesting dual benefit because not only are they using it for as a cooling mechanism, they're then utilizing the generated hot water. Which is produced obviously from cooling to feed back into upstream systems in terms of heating buildings. So they're creating, in essence, a sort of a circular economy approach. So there's sort of quite a number of movements here we're seeing at the moment, Doug.
Well, this has really been interesting. And I know that we're just sort of scratching the surface. So, but is the report available for anyone to look at?
It is. It's available on our website, which is spirent.com. If you go there, you can access the report and download it. And as I said, there's a lot of detail in it in terms of not only focusing on sort of the data centers, but also looking at how the evolution of Ethernet is impacting also our telecom networks and our enterprise networks. So not just the large enterprises, right through to the smaller enterprises as well.
Were there any surprises? I picked up at the beginning of our conversation that this was an actually an inaugural report. This
Mhm.
is the first one you've done, so there was no comparison to 23. But anything that surprised you or your team?
Yeah, I mean, the reason it was inaugural, I mean, high-speed Ethernet's been going for years,
Right.
and and we've been in a privileged position being in this market, helping test it, and even help the standards develop it for years. But it's been a sort of, I would call this a steady ship. There's been interesting technology changes, but we've pretty much known where it's been going for, year on year. So it maybe hasn't seemed that exciting.
Hmm.
The AI inflection point has been just massive on it, and
Right.
this is a massive change, and it's accelerated sort of the evolution. I think that's the big point. With probably as an industry, you're seeing sort of the refresh evolution to the higher speeds and the requirements in Ethernet probably being coming forward anywhere between 2 to 3 years faster than they typically would have done. And you're also seeing a big mindset change in terms of how Ethernet has to perform. Most Ethernet today, used for the types of applications you and I would use or the telecom networks use, can be lossy. The video communication, it can be lossy because the codecs and everything can deal with it. So it doesn't need to be perfect that way. AI is a very different beast. It can't deal with that.
Hmm.
And it means that you're starting to redesign how this technology works to serve all these types of use cases simultaneously. And that's a big change. And it is the backbone, pretty much of all our communication networks today.
Right.
You know, if you think about it, the radio networks are great, but I'm only on the radio network for a very short distance, and then I'm onto a physical wireline network, usually with Ethernet as the key component of it. So that's probably been the big change has been the AI. I think the other one, Doug, I just would highlight, we're talking about AI traffic being moved across these networks. I think the other big dynamic that's going on is that AI is also being embedded inside many of the technologies here that are moving that traffic about. So you're starting to see
Right.
our switches, our routers, our firewalls, all of that infrastructure is starting to now adopt AI as well to make it more intelligent how it moves the bits and bytes across the networks and how it provides security as well. And that's also a real interesting sort of change that's starting to happen. I mean, you're going to see a lot more of it over the next sort of 18 to 24 months.
One last thought. I was very struck by the amount of retooling you were describing, and this must be very expensive. And I'm wondering who's picking up the tab on that. That's a lot of infrastructure to switch out. And yet, like we were talking about earlier, the whole idea of the data center, the cloud, and so on was to reduce the cost, not to raise the cost. So I mean, do you think that's going to go on and on? You see where I'm going, right? Are costs going to start to actually go up? Because I don't
Uh,
think they can do that out of nothing.
no, I think that's part of the a second sort of discussion that's going on at the moment. I mean, the investment going into the data centers today is just growing exponentially, and that
Right.
is they're building new architectures. They're building new network infrastructure. So that's happening. The question then becomes, as that trickles down, as I said, into the other parts of the networks, out to the end device, out to the enterprise. Um, how do you justify, the investment yourselves to upgrade your networks as well to potentially, if you're going to host some of this yourself, or if you need your transport infrastructure to be able to support the traffic demands. And that's still a little bit of an unknown, I have to admit, Doug, at the moment, in terms of, what type of value or benefit monetary is AI generating at the moment. And I think a lot of industries are looking at that, trying to make that decision. Um, but there is a little bit of a race going on as well. We're seeing at the moment. Do you wait and be left behind?
Right.
Um, because for those companies or those enterprises that do adopt AI, will they automatically have a competitive advantage rapidly over you? And are you out of the gate? So it's a tough decision, I have to admit, for a lot of them, because you're nearly putting the investment down first before you maybe understand fully the benefit that AI is going to deliver to you. So it'll be an interesting sort of next coming years at the moment. Personally, I wouldn't get left behind. I think what we're seeing at the moment, some of the benefits it's actually delivering are hugely impressive. And that's so I do anticipate this is where the investment's really going to be going in the next number of years.
Well, Steve, I really want to thank you for joining me today. This has been really interesting. Again, we've just scratched the surface here. I hope we get to do a further podcast and an update on this actual report to see, how your team is receiving it later on and how things are occurring, especially as we roll into 2025. But for now, thank you very much for joining me today, sharing this, and I want to recommend to all my readers and listeners go to Spirent.com and take a look. I think it'd be well worth it.
Thanks, Doug.